Brazen Chariots, Tank Warfare in North Africa, November 1941. The Ballantine paperback by Major Robert Crisp. Sixth Day, page 54. In Britain, this Sunday, the last in November, is the end of the ecclesiastical year. In the German church calendar, it is known as Totensonntag, the Sunday of the Dead, and thus it was labeled for history by the German Africa Corps. The appellation would have been a good deal more accurate if applied to a kind of All Souls' Day of the South African Dutch Reformed Church. During the night, a few stray honeys had wandered into our little resting place, and at 5:30 on Sunday morning, the total available strength of the 3rd Royal Tank Regiment, all 7 of it, was ordered to move southwest on a bearing of 210 degrees. Where the order came from, only the colonel knew, as the desert around us was empty of honeys. There was no sign of Brigade HQ, nor of 5RTR, nor of the 8th Hussars, nor of our own A and B squadrons. There was just our battalion headquarters and the remains of 2 troops of C Squadron. We knew where some of our tanks were, all right. They were at the bottom of those columns of smoke which still rose black and thick from the depression, invisible over the escarpment a mile to the northwest. Smoke and dust of yesterday's battle still hung in the unmoving air, and unbelievable whistling came from a random truck some 40 yards away whose crew were making breakfast. As we watched, wondering about the day that was now opening about us, the first red rays caught the columnar crests of smoke, dissipating them in wisps of blood. I thought, for no particular reason, that it must have looked like that when the Israelites were led out of Egypt. As the tank engines warmed up, the dismounted crews clambered up behind the honeys until such time as contact could be made with our B-echelon lorries, and they could go back and await the arrival of the new vehicles. I sat on the back of the adjutant's tank. It was warm on top of the engine, wondering how I could get myself a honey and trying to work out my movements if we ran into a battle. There was little I could do about anything. No transport was available, and there was no place to go anyway. I was damned if I was going to sit on my arse all day watching the Battle of Sidi Rezek from the edge of the escarpment. I didn't think it was going to last very long at that. As the sun lifted red and solid out of the desert, we came into what can only be described as a densely populated area. Hundreds of vehicles, lorries, trucks, staff cars, 10-tonners, jeeps, wireless vans, command cars, armored cars, surrounded us on all sides. Peaceful smoke from dozens of breakfast fires hung lazily over the scene. Looking around me in amazement from my perch on the back of the honey, I was delighted to see the orange shoulder flashes of South Africans and the friendly but anxious black faces of African troops going about their morning chores. We had run into the HQ area of the 5th South African Brigade somewhere just southwest of Harafit on Nebeldat. Our covey of tanks pulled up, and I saw the colonel dismount and start talking to one of the senior officers shaving alongside a staff car. I jumped down and soon found myself among friends, including Ronnie Grieveson, the Transvaal and South African cricketer, who gave me news of other cricketing contemporaries of mine. Bruce Mitchell was one scattered around the western desert. He also supplied us with inevitable and delicious mugs of coffee, and after one look at me, invited me to use his wash basin and shaving kit. A grinning African Batman brought a can of hot water. It was just like old times on a shooting trip in the veld. I had managed to get my hands wet and soaped when I heard the adjutant calling my name. He beckoned hurriedly from the turret of his honey, and I noticed that the CO's tank was already on the move. I managed to splash some of that wonderful hot water on my face and then ran for it, wiping off the mud with a muddier handkerchief. With much grinning and waving and yelling of rude Afrikaans phrases, we went on our way through the vehicles and men and paraphernalia. Above the roar of the engine, the adjutant was bellowing the latest griff. We were to continue on our bearing of 210 degrees until we came to a spot called Haglet El Garbia. I looked at the map propped on my knees and saw that this was on the track running from El Adem to the trig El Abd, about 5 miles south of our present position. When we got there, the adjutant shouted we were to link up with our brigade HQ, which was somewhere in that area. I wondered how on earth brigade had managed to get down there, and looked forward to being able to pick up another honey if there were any left over from the previous night's escapades. We were crossing a comparatively deserted strip of desert, and I could see the mass of vehicles we had just left slipping down over the horizon behind me. Engrossed in my thoughts and my map reading, I was jerked back to reality by a sudden commotion about the tank. We were engulfed in a mad rush of trucks and lorries scattering over the desert to the north and east, while everywhere soldiers on foot ran for slit trenches and disappeared incredibly into the sand. I gaped round the corner of the turret and saw that we had come into another South African lager area, even vaster and more densely packed with transport of all kinds than the one we had so recently left. Several shells burst just ahead of us showed part of the reason for the sudden commotion. The adjutant leaned back and yelled into my ear, "You better get off, Bob. Your South African pals are being attacked by tanks, and we've got to go and help them." I nodded and jumped off and ran over to where I could see a few officers trying to get things organized. I noticed a few armored cars and a couple of honeys lying around, but who they belonged to I could not even guess. I soon discovered that we were in among the 5th Brigade, B Echelon, the entire outfit, and they were in a fine state of flap, with enemy tanks apparently all round them. All of a sudden I saw the unmistakable squat shape of a German Mark III, accompanied by a lesser Mark II, coming right through the lager, about 100 yards from me. I thought I was seeing things. But they were there all right, turrets closed, jinking about a bit, but coming straight for us. Everybody around me suddenly went to ground, very properly. I was unused to this sort of evasive action, and I did what was, for me, the instinctive thing. I made as fast as I could for the nearest honey. It was facing away from the approaching panzers, and as I clambered up the back, I could see the commander looking rather abstractedly out towards the west, without a clue of what was happening just behind him. "Hey, you!" I yelled, thumping him on the shoulder and noticing with some relief as I did so that he was a sergeant. "There's a Jerry tank just behind you. Shoot it!" He looked up at me blankly, uncomprehending. "Where are you from?" I shouted. "What battalion?" "4th Armored Brigade Headquarters," he said, and then, looking at my shoulder, added, "Sir?" "Then, man, get after those tanks!" I pointed to the panzers, which were now just going past about 30 yards away, their guns silent, still heading north in a puzzled sort of way, scattering men like a bow wave from their course. "This is the signals tank, sir. We've never fired the gun." "Out," I said. "Quick!" "But the brigadier—" I grabbed him by his webbing equipment and jerked him out of the turret. "Never mind the brigadier. I'll fix that when I see him. Out!" He accepted the situation, bemused and reluctant. I climbed into the turret and grabbed the intercom mic. "Driver, advance right. Gunner, get that bloody cannon loaded. You're going to get yourself a German tank in about 2 minutes. I don't know what their reaction was. I hoped to hell that the driver knew how to drive and that the gunner knew how to aim and pull the trigger. I didn't even know that there were 3 men down there. However, the tank started to move, and it went in the ordered direction. The breech block clanged as the shell was rammed in, so that was all right, too. The panzers did not confront me with any serious problem. I had a rough idea of what was happening inside those Jerry turrets. They had gone astray from their column and were a damn sight more frightened than any of the South Africans they were scattering. We went pretty carefully through the lager to avoid running over anybody, and then caught up with the Mark III about 100 yards outside the perimeter. It still seemed in a bit of a daze, wondering where to go. It took my anonymous gunner 3 shots to hit it. Then I saw the tracer going into the engine louvers, and smoke started to roll out immediately. At the same time, the turret opened and the crew spilled out. As soon as they saw what was happening, the men inside the Mark II got weaving. They shot off into the open space between the 2 lagers. I saw a couple of Marmon Harrington armored cars closing in on it and left them to it. The crew of the Mark III started to walk back towards us with their hands raised. I pointed them out to a bunch of South Africans nearby, and they went over to bring them in. My new crew and I drove happily back through the lager. It felt good to have a tank around me again. Inside the turret, I could see the gunner and operator looking very pleased with themselves, and I leaned down and patted the gunner on the back. "You ain't seen nothing yet," I said to myself. "Poor buggers." The Honey moved carefully through the clustered transport, heading for the southern side, where I hoped to find my CO and get under command again. Every now and then a native would jump up from a slit trench with arms raised in surrender. I dug into my memory for Zulu and kitchen Kafir inanities and cuss words and yelled at them, those bewildered blacks. It was great to see the look of incredulity on their faces, and then the sheepishness and the great guffawing and head-shaking as the situation penetrated. Ow, this was something else to tell them back at the kraal. The Mafu told me to Hambalapakia Kawena when I surrendered. Ow! The rest of the battalion honeys were spread along the south-facing edge, and we joined them just in time to get mixed up in a wild and indiscriminate encounter with a column of German tanks and transport which was moving northwest across the corner of the lager. We all started blazing away like mad, and with a couple of troops of anti-tank guns joining in and some 25-pounders thumping away from somewhere in the rear, the attack, if it was meant to be an attack on us, was beaten off, and the column moved off out of range. 2 or 3 enemy armored cars straggled about behind the column, and when I thought it discreet enough, I shot my Honey out towards them to cut them off. 2 of them got away, but I cornered one after a short running fight. We pulled alongside as the white handkerchief fluttered from the top of the turret, and a very frightened face looked over the top. I indicated the lager and told him with much gesticulation to get moving. A South African armored car came up, and together we shepherded the enemy vehicle back. When I felt sure he would not try and get away, I left them and swanned about the now empty desert looking for some more easy pickings. It felt nice and unconfined out there, and I was in no hurry to get back, but nothing happened, so we moved leisurely towards the lager. The leisureliness was deliberate. That lager was rimmed by a number of trigger-happy gunners in tanks and behind 2-pounders. Any form of violent movement on their front could startle one of them into action. After the events of the past 24 hours, nobody could be blamed for shooting first and holding the post-mortem later. That was why, as we drew nearer, I waved my handkerchief over my head and hoped to God the gunners had studied their tank silhouettes. Nobody fired, and we moved peacefully into the brigade lines. I was making for a little cluster of honeys which had moved from the southern flank and seemed to be taking up a position facing west when, without any order from me, the tank came to a jerky stop. I knew what the answer was before the driver's message reached me. We had run out of petrol. I told the crew to dismount and got down to see if there was any petrol to be scrounged from the South Africans. At a nearby lorry, a young officer explained that they were very short themselves, but he would let me have 1 4-gallon tin. It was ordinary motor spirit, of course, and I could not expect to get any high-octane stuff from that echelon. I carried the tin back to the Honey and saw that my new driver was just climbing out of the front. It was the first time I had seen him. To my astonishment, he had no sooner got to the ground than he started running round and round in small circles with a wild look on his face. The poor chap had just been in action for the first time in his life and hadn't the faintest idea where he was or what he was doing. The other 2 members of the crew stood there gaping at him but did nothing. I walked quickly over, and as the driver went past on one of his running circles, I caught him with a tremendous kick in the backside. It jerked his head back and stopped him in his tracks. I grabbed him by the shoulder and shook him hard. "Listen, I'm your new tank commander. We're in the South African lager. Our Honey has run out of petrol. Here's a 4-gallon tin. Now, fill up." He made a visible effort to pull himself together, rubbed his behind a little, and said, "Yes, sir." I told the wireless operator to get back on the set and try to get onto the battalion net so that I could keep contact with my CO. The gunner came up to say that the machine gun had never been fired and he'd like to go and check it and the ammo. That's the stuff, I told him. That Browning will be the end of all of us if it doesn't work properly at the right time. And don't forget to carve yourself a couple of notches on the 37-millimeter barrel. While the crew were getting things ready, I walked over to the edge of the laager and looked out across the desert to the west, where, half an hour before, the German column had gone past in a blaze of gunfire, dust, and smoke. Where all had been noise and frightfulness, the sands were now silent and barren. Suddenly I saw 3 vehicles come over a low rise and halt on the horizon about 2 miles away. I could just see men running about in a bustle of activity, and with some curiosity I lifted my binoculars and focused on them. I was flabbergasted to see a troop of German field guns just going into action. As I watched, I saw the puffs of smoke from the gun muzzles as they fired round after round in a northerly direction towards the Sidi Rezegh escarpment. They seemed to be quite oblivious to the presence of enemy troops within 2 miles of them, though they could not possibly have missed seeing that vast array of transport. They were either completely clueless or completely arrogant. I had already, more or less subconsciously, made up my mind what to do, working out the chances of success, calculating the recklessness required. I searched the desert carefully for any signs of approaching enemy vehicles or for any dug-in infantry and anti-tank guns that might be protecting the battery. There was nothing. The desert was bare. The German gunners were on their own. I ran back to my honey. I knew what I was going to do, but I needed a little support, and looked around hopefully, wishing that Harry McGrath could be alongside me. Down the line of trucks and 2-pounder Portees, I picked out the familiar turret of one of our tanks. I ran quickly down and climbed up behind the commander, a flamboyant, mustached lieutenant in the 5th Battalion. I didn't waste time asking what the hell he was doing there, but told him quickly about the guns and what I was going to do, and that I wanted him to come with me. He looked as though he didn't quite believe what I was saying, but then he had a long look through his binoculars and was plainly impressed by the possibilities, although still reluctant. "I'd better ask the CO," he began rather hesitantly. "Don't ask him, tell him. Look, you'll see me leaving the laager just up there. Follow me." I jumped down before he had time to argue or think up any of the very good reasons why we shouldn't do it. Back on my honey, everything was set, guns loaded and engine running, even if not too smoothly on that inadequate petrol. The operator hadn't been able to raise the colonel, but that didn't matter for the time being. "Driver, advance," I ordered, and steered him carefully through the vehicles before telling him to speed up. We made a wide deviation once we had got clear of the laager so that we could come up behind the German guns. I took one look behind me and saw the other honey following on, then gave all my attention to my little plan. We were doing a good 30 miles an hour now, and the success of the whole venture depended upon getting right up to the Germans before they saw us. There was no difficulty about anticipating their immediate reactions. If they didn't run like hell, they would be swinging their guns round to try to knock us out. But as the barrels were pointing up at the sky somewhere to give them the range to the escarpment, it was not a thing to cause a great deal of concern. It was simply a matter of timing. If they saw me in time to swing their guns round and depress them, then we had had it. If we were able to get on top of them unnoticed, there was no danger. Every second made us more secure. The other honey was swerving around behind me, not going quite as fast as I wanted him to, perhaps, but it wasn't his idea anyway. Certainly there was no time for slowing down and waiting for him to catch up. It did not matter much where he was. In fact, the mere sight of him steaming up would be enough to accentuate and maintain the impression I was sure of creating. 300 yards to go, and the German guns were still firing northwards, their gunners engrossed in their occupation. Another second or two, and I could see clearly the gun teams going through their well-drilled loading and firing and reloading movements. Not a single head was turned in my direction. Already I knew I had eliminated the possibility of being blown to bits by any of those shells, unless something went very wrong at my end. After a certain point of time and distance, I was in command of the moment. It is a fine feeling. With about 150 yards to go, someone suddenly spotted me. I could almost hear the wild yell of fright and alarm and see the look of unbelief and consternation as every visible face turned towards the racing tank. Then the Jerries scattered from behind their guns, and I gave a sharp order, "Driver, slow down, halt, Browning, men and guns, fire." The tank pulled up not 50 yards from the enemy, and as we lurched to a standstill, the Browning barked briefly. I watched the sand flick up around and beyond the guns. I waited for the next burst, and then sensed with some dismay that the blasted gun had jammed. At the same time, I saw the field gun nearest me swinging round as a couple of men behind it, a good deal braver than the rest, worked feverishly to get it round and trained on the honey. I wasn't particularly worried, as I could see the barrel still pointing upward at an angle of about 45 degrees, but there wasn't going to be all that amount of time, and above all, I had to maintain the psychological impact. I gave another order down the intercom. 37, nearest field gun, fire. There was a pause of about 3 seconds as tank and gun crew worked desperately to get the first shot in. The Jerries never had a chance. They had managed to get their weapons swiveled round roughly in my direction, and then, panic-stricken, one of them had pulled the trigger. I heard the bang, saw the smoke, and heard the whoosh of air above me all in one split second. Every detail of the faces of those 3 men is etched on my memory. I could see the unshaven growth on cheeks and chins. I could see duty and courage struggling with fear and contorting their faces into awful grimaces. The man nearest me was feverishly turning a handle which was depressing the gun slowly. The muzzle was dropping inch by inch. Just behind him, another man had picked up a shell and was slamming it into the breech. Around the corner of the gun, I could see half a man crouched in an aiming position. It was 3 seconds of time encompassing half a dozen lifetimes. It took my gunner 3 seconds to get the cross wires trained on the heart of that field gun. Then he pulled the trigger. The whip crack of the 37mm hit my ears, and I saw the quick, dull red circle glow in the solid metal of the gun in front of me. The Germans dropped to the sand. Immediately one got up and hobbled off, his right hand holding his leg just above the knee, the other arm raised in a gesture of surrender. The other 2 men lay where they had fallen, and I did not see them move again. The second honey pulled up alongside its guns trained on a bunch of 30 or 40 men who had collected between vehicles and guns with hands held high. Some of them were crawling incongruously up through the sand on hands and knees. In spite of the successful outcome of the little raid, the situation was not one which I relished. Those Germans were frightened to death at the moment, but sooner or later one of them would summon up a shred of courage and take a pot shot at me with a Luger. Unless I could keep them frightened to death, I shouted to the operator to pass me out the Tommy gun, and when I got it, I fired a couple of sharp bursts into the sand behind any Jerry who was a bit slow in joining his comrades. I yelled at them in Afrikaans and made expressive gestures with my hands. Their reaction was quite automatic. They reached higher than ever with their arms and fell into a solid column of 4s. Some of them even beckoned to the stragglers to get a move on. Soon they were heading for our lager area at a shambling trot. At this moment, several men jumped out of the back of one of the lorries and ran toward my tank. They were wearing battle dress and black tank corps berets and were yelling like mad. I took my earphones off to hear them. "British!" they shouted. "British! We're British!" They stopped at the foot of the honey and shouted again at me, still bewildered at the startling turn of events. "We're British, sir! We were captured!" "Okay," I said, grinning at them. "Jump on!" They clambered up onto the back and settled down among the bedding, chattering with pleasure and relief and relaxed tension. The prisoners were still shambling off, shepherded by the other honey, and I turned my attention to the guns. For a few seconds I contemplated hitching them all up behind the lorries and driving them back. It would have been a nice finale to the act, which I couldn't help recognizing was about 50% exhibitionism anyway. Then away to the south I saw the dark shapes appearing over the horizon and moving quickly towards us. The race was on, and I didn't intend to lose it, even if it meant losing my prisoners. Before we left, I had the gunner plant a solid 37mm shot into each gun, aiming at the breech block. A shell landed about 40 yards away, and it was quickly followed by a second, considerably nearer, It was time to go. Now it was over, the reaction set in. As far as I was concerned, the whole thing was quite purposeless if I did not get back to the South Africans all in one piece. I felt like running away as fast as possible, back to the herd. There were still the prisoners. I no longer had a great deal of interest in them and found it impossible, not for the first or last time, to work up any positive feelings of dislike or enmity. My concern in getting them back was purely a matter of finishing things off adequately, of getting the signature of universal approval. But it wasn't all that important. Shells were beginning to fall regularly, and every now and again I felt the unmistakable, breathtaking swish of an armor-piercing shot going past. We hurried after the trotting column and the other honey. Instinctively, I placed the tank so that the prisoners were between me and the enemy vehicles advancing from the south. I felt a little ashamed about this, but what the hell? Then our honey came to a dead stop, and the engine spluttered into silence. The self-starter whirled away in short bursts of frustration, and I thought immediately, the bloody petrol. The second honey was moving slowly further and further away, apparently in ignorance of our plight. I told the driver to keep on trying in the hope that it may have been just a blocked feed, and then got everybody on my tank to wave their arms like mad to attract the attention of the red-mustached commander who was slipping gently, it seemed, out of my life. We were out of touch with anybody on the air who could do us any good, and all our hopes were centered on that one silhouette perched on top of a receding turret. The black shapes over our right shoulder were coming a little more purposefully across the desert floor now, but their shell fire still seemed a bit hesitant and inaccurate. They must have wondered what the hell was going on. The three troopers on the back cooperated enthusiastically in our effort to attract attention. Their faces were a picture of understandable misery at the prospect of being blown to pieces by a direct hit or being put in the bag once again. We still had a good 1,000 yards to go to the comparative safety of the South African lager, and I was beginning to think of walking it when I saw the other honey stop, pause a moment or two in indecision, and then come wheeling back towards us. When it came alongside, it did not take more than a second or two to discover that neither vehicle had a tow rope. There was nothing for it but to abandon the tank and transfer to the other one. By now, the oncoming panzers were about as far from us as we were from the lager. We could not expect very much longer to enjoy this rather haphazard immunity. My fifth tank's colleague evidently thought so too. We were no sooner on board than he ordered full speed ahead, and we roared past the column of Germans still headed for the distant lager with arms in the air. It was a pity to leave those prisoners, but I was all for it. The last I saw of them was a black blob on the desert, still moving, but with their hands no longer raised. It was not difficult to imagine their conversation. The honey was getting near the friendly perimeter now, going hell-bent. I waited for it to slow down, and then noticed that the tank commander was looking back towards the Jerry's, and that any minute the vehicle would go plunging into our own lines. I yelled and bent down over the front to try and stop the driver with a hand signal. At the same time, the commander must have seen the situation looming up swiftly ahead of him, and given a violent order to the driver. The honey stopped dead in its tracks. Unfortunately, I went sailing on at about 35 miles an hour and landed with a frightful crunch on my shoulder and the side of my face at the feet of some very puzzled anti-tank gunners. I walked into the lager area sore, cursing and picking bits of gravel out of my skin. It was no doubt a suitable anticlimax. I felt lousy and deflated, and I was on my flat feet again, tankless. My recent crew gravitated towards me with the 3 escaped prisoners. I told them to try and locate their sergeant and then report to the most senior officer they could find. "Thanks for everything," I said to them. "You've done very well. See you back at brigade one of these days." They saluted smartly and went off, looking, I thought, rather relieved. I wandered around trying to pick out a honey in the welter of vehicles that could lead me to the colonel and, if possible, another tank. I found the honeys first and then the CO in a small group of officers and NCOs huddled over their maps. I joined them silently, but if I hoped to discover what was going on everywhere, I was to be disappointed. With brief jabs of his finger, the CO pointed to where he thought various headquarters were. 4th Armored Brigade was scattered all over the desert. He had heard nothing but Our own A and B squadrons and the 5th Tanks and 8th Hussars were in more or less the same position. The general situation was equally obscure and confused, but it had been reported that there was a considerable concentration of enemy tanks and vehicles to the south and southwest of our position. General Gott, commanding the 7th Armored Division, had been personally in touch with the CO, and we had orders to stay in the South African lager and assist them against any attack which might be made. For a moment or two I considered telling them about my little episode with the field guns, but as the first sentences formed themselves in my mind, it struck me that it would sound like a hell of a line shoot, and this was neither the time nor the place for line shooting. We walked together down to the southern edge of the escarpment, and started across the sand and scrub to the southwest. Only the burnt-out remains of tanks and lorries and the motionless shapes of unrecognizable derelicts relieved the flat monotony. I wondered what had happened to my prisoners and to their guns and to the tanks which had chased us off. I scanned the horizon to the west, but could see no sign of them. With a proper awareness of the situation, they had probably wasted no time in getting away. There was a long, low ridge some 2 or 3 miles to the southward of us where we stood, and it must have been behind this fold in the ground that the massing of enemy forces was invisibly proceeding. I looked at my watch as we broke up, and the tank commanders went back to their vehicles. I was surprised to see that the morning had gone. A strange and ominous lull drifted over the afternoon, gray under its canopy of cloud. Men moved silently between slit trenches, working shirtless to get them deeper, or sat leaning back against truck wheels, eating their meager rations. Every now and then an armored car would move swiftly across the skyline. I told the colonel shortly how I had come to be without a tank. It was news to him that I had managed to get one, and said that I would like to have another one to go out and try to recover mine. He let me have one of his headquarters troop, and I had a quick meal on my new crew's biscuits and jam. We even had a brew on a borrowed South African fire while I practiced my rusty Afrikaans. I was in no great hurry. Just after 3 o'clock, the adjutant came round our half-dozen tanks to tell each of us that the armored cars out in front had reported a mass movement of the enemy towards the lager area, and that an attack seemed to be imminent. Each tank was to select a position between the anti-tank guns which had moved into line around the southern and western perimeters. The only battle orders we had were to keep the enemy out. We climbed back into our tanks, all weary in body and spirit, numb after the accumulating impact of events, without the energy for imagination, without the anticipation of fear. Each honey moved off to the spot selected by its commander. I chose a vacant space between 2 two-pounders still mounted on the backs of their portees, their crews crouched behind the flimsy protection of the gun shield. They looked horribly exposed on top of those vehicles, and I wondered why they hadn't gone to ground and got properly dug in. From being on the receiving end, I knew only too well what a vicious weapon a concealed, dug-in anti-tank gun can be. I leaned over and asked them why they preferred to be on top of their truck instead of below the surface. They grinned back at me and said that they hadn't been in any one place more than an hour for the past 2 days, and asked if I had tried to do any digging around these parts. "It's as rocky as hell under the top 6 inches, they told me. Well, I grinned back, it's none of my mucking business. I was too late to do anything about it anyway. We were grouped right on the southwestern corner of the lager, facing almost due south. We had barely finished our little chat when the horizon to our front grew unsubstantial and mobile, with the dark silhouettes of what looked like hundreds of vehicles. I shouted, "Here come Hole," to my South African neighbors, and told the gunner to load both guns. Then, with touchy memories of the morning, I ordered the driver to switch off. If we had to stay there, we wouldn't be needing the engine. If we had to move, we would need all the petrol we could save. I felt sorry for the driver in his silent, impotent little cabin, seeing that visible death coming towards him. As the massed enemy drew nearer, they became distinguishable as a vast array of tanks, guns, and lorried infantry in what was by now a familiar battle formation, a solid, embattled column with the heavy panzers at the head of the battering ram and a ponderous phalanx of destruction, followed by the lines of tall lorries protected on flank and rear by the ranks of light tanks and armored cars. There appeared to be 20 or 30 panzers in the leading block, and about as many other armored vehicles in the rest of the column. Lord, I thought, this is it. Nothing can stop that lot. It's worse than yesterday. Yesterday I could at least run away. They came steadily nearer, a great black juggernaut of irresistible menace, the somber camouflage of the tanks red-tinged as the frightened sun sank behind them. Then our artillery went into action, breaking up the solidity of the design with sudden bursts of smoke and dirt. But there was no break in the tempo or the purpose of that evil, crawling mass. We waited for the tanks to come within range of our puny guns, letting the full and horrible fascination of the sight sink indelibly into our minds forever. To some of us, forever was still going to be quite a long time. To some of us, forever was only going to be a few more seconds. As I watched them, I became aware that the course they were on would carry them past the lager. They were heading northwest, and unless they changed direction, they would run right across the southwestern corner, a good 500 yards clear. I felt a vast weight lift off my spirit. We were not going to be physically overrun by those massive tracks. We were not the real objective. Somewhere over the horizon lay the real target. The objective was still Sidi Rezek. It was a fleeting thought, but it lightened my darkness. We could see the gun flashes sprouting from the squat turrets, and the air grew noisy and foul as the shells started falling among us. Another full minute of dreadful inactivity as we waited for our own guns to become effective, and then 2-pounder and 37mm started barking back with their shriller yapping. The air was suddenly full of tracer, curving out in long rods and then cavorting up to the sky as shot hit those thick armored sides. I gave my gunner the fire order and was momentarily startled by its familiar sound. It was exactly the same as I had given to the other gunner, how many hours and how many gunners ago, on the airfield at Sidi Rezek. 37 enemy tanks, stick on one till you stop it, fire! And I watched the red tracer screaming out as the whip crack of the gun jarred my teeth. That was a hit, I told the gunner. Stay with it. On each side of me, the South African 2-pounders were firing as fast as they could be loaded. I felt sorry for them and a little embarrassed at my own comparative security. Even as I watched, the shield in front of the right-hand gun disintegrated in slivers of steel from a direct hit, and the man sitting behind it, with his eye to the telescopic sight, disintegrated in slivers of flesh. Men dragged away the mutilated body and then went back to their job. The gun went on firing for a few more shots, then the portee heaved again, and 2 men threw up their arms and lurched off onto the sand. I got a little lower in the turret. The enemy column was now at its closest point to the South African position, and the battle in my vicinity reached a crescendo of noise and furiousness. The mass of tanks passed steadily across our front, and the dark air was patterned with tracers and the vivid flashes of guns. Behind it all, the sun had left a broad, blood-red trail across the sky, bathing the desert in this ominous light, lighting up the steel sides of the panzer horde and the dark canvas of the infantry lorries with a glow straight from the fires of hell. Automatically, I watched the tracers from my own guns screaming off, not curved now, but hurtling in a flat line at the nearest Mark IVs. Suddenly, above the din, I heard my gunner yelling, "Got him, sir! I got him! That's the second bastard!" I saw the great black shape halt and stay immobile as the column passed on. The turret did not open, and no lazy, telltale smoke could be seen. I watched its gun carefully through my binoculars. It was silent. I leant down to pat the gunner and said into the mic, grinning at him, "Nice work, Hawk. Keep it going. You're winning the battle." I heard the 37mm crack again, and almost disinterestedly I watched the tracer. The anti-tank gun on my left was still firing hard, partly protected by the Honey's armor. The one on my right was shattered and mute, and so was its crew. Subconsciously, I was aware of the tumult all around, the black, smelly clouds that wafted over the tank every few seconds from a nearby shell burst. I was hypnotized by that mass of doom moving across the flat plain of the desert. It was a feeling stronger than fear, stronger than any sort of personal sensation, as though I were some detached, corporate observer, functioning as a tank commander by force of habit and familiar drill. More than ever, I was conscious of relief at the realization that we were not their objective. We were an incidental obstacle, a brief encounter. Where the hell are they going, I thought. Why don't they turn now and ride right over us? But they went on, past the point of proximity, on into the emptiness of the northwest, away from us towards their intended engagement. Behind them they left the smoking relics of their passage, and as the great tanks churned on, the staccato rattle of machine gun fire replaced the boom and thunder of the guns and shells. Every now and then a mushroom of flame and smoke would leap skyward as one of their lorries was set alight by a direct hit, spilling its human cargo onto the sands. At one moment there was a great orange-colored upheaval as the complete turret of a Mark III lifted bodily into the air from some internal explosion. I felt a jerk on my trouser leg and looked down to hear the operator yelling that there was no more ammunition. Within the next few minutes, the other tank commanders could all be heard telling the CO that they had run out of ammo and asking what they were to do about it. The reply was specific. We were to stay where we were in the line. Nobody was to move until ordered. It was a grim 10 minutes just sitting there in that turbulent twilight while the shells whined and crashed round and the desert heaved and men reared up grotesquely and then lay still or twitching. But the high peak of the action had passed with the passing of the panzers, and every minute lessened the tension and the menace. With our guns pitifully silent, fighting the enemy with static armor plating and the moral effect of our presence on those about us, I don't think any of the honeys would have moved out of line at that moment, even if they had been allowed to. As the tempo of the battle slackened and the light dwindled with a cruel reluctance, we got our orders to pull out and rally by the colonel's tank about 100 yards back. We could just see the twin yellow pennants fluttering at the head of his wireless aerial. The order emphasized that we were to reverse very slowly out of our positions and to create as little alarm as possible. There was still plenty of stuff whizzing around, but mostly small arms fire, and I think the less fortunate people on the ground found our continued presence some reassurance against a possible infantry attack. I told the driver to start up and had my usual moment of suspense and relief as the starter whirred and the engine fired. We moved back imperceptibly, but I was immediately conscious of the puzzled, angry looks on the faces of the infantrymen and gunners. I knew exactly what they were thinking, and for the sake of the tanks, rather than myself, I shouted to them, "Our ammo's finished. We're just pulling back to get more." Their expression changed to relief and understanding. Some of them smiled and waved or gave the thumbs-up sign. We continued to back away slowly through the vehicles and slit trenches past all the other worried, perplexed looks, feeling uncomfortable about it, but glad to go. From the different corners of the perimeter, the meager band of honeys converged on the high pennants. Alongside the colonel's tank was a lean-looking crusader, and perched on its turret, studying a map, was our CO, together with a tall man in a white sheepskin jacket and a peaked cap. I recognized him as General Gott, the divisional commander. Poor devil, I thought. What a way to have run a battle. Tearing round the desert, looking for your brigades and regiments, telling each group separately what they had to do, trying to make something cohesive out of that utter confusion. At the same time, I wondered if we wouldn't have all been better off if the Germans had stayed at their post. At the same time, I wondered if we wouldn't all have been better off if the generals had stayed at their posts. A few minutes' quick conversation, and the colonel jumped down, saluting smartly as the crusader wheeled about and snaked off into the gathering night. The CO beckoned us over. It was just to tell us that we were to pull back into a New Zealand lager for the night. He couldn't satisfy our curiosity or relieve our bewilderment and fears. Apparently nobody, not even the enemy, knew what the hell was going on anywhere. Somehow we all felt very much better at the knowledge that there were now New Zealand troops in the battle area. It was not only that it meant that here were new sources of strength which had not yet been fully committed, but from a joint experience in Greece and Crete, we knew what wonderful troops they were. I know what was in my mind, and I think it was a feeling shared by all of us, that we would be able to get some rest during the night without fear of being massacred. We went off behind the CO in a much brighter frame of mind, buoyed up by the knowledge of the powerful forces still unused on our side, and confident that the battle we had thought nearly lost would now be won. In single file, we moved away from the South Africans, wondering what would happen to them, hoping someone would do something about them. In the darkness, we came to the New Zealanders, moving cautiously until we had cleared their outlying pickets. We were expected, and we were guided to an area which we could spend the night. We were expected and were guided to an area in which we could spend the night, a few hours before the lightning east would disperse us again in wakefulness. My new tank crew, being in headquarters troop, were adepts at making hot tea without showing a flicker of light. That was a mug of tea. When we had finished it, too tired to be hungry and too exhausted and satiated with incident to discuss the day past or the day to come, we fell asleep where we sat or slouched. My own few lines of immortality on Toten Sonntag were scribbled in German in the war diary of 15th Panzer. Quote, "A battery of Artillery Regiment 33 was overrun by a sudden charge of English tanks and forced to surrender. The battery was recaptured and later brought into action again." Much later, I hope.